Lesson 2, this is Clockwork, all wound up by Philip Pullman. This week when we get together, I will be asking you about if you think there's a theme that links vampirates to Clockwork. Okay, that's the first thing. The second aspect is, did you find out the meaning of macabre? And did you find any words that linked to time when you read the preface? Any menacing words? And were there any words that you didn't know? And did you look them up? And what did you think? Did you also find out about why Pullman wrote the book? So he was in the Science Museum. I expect you read about this. He was in the Science Museum and he was looking at clocks. And he realised that the clocks, the way the cogs turn and the way that they work, one cog turns, another cog turns, and they move on and they develop through. And he was thinking, what about if I wrote a story like that ideas linked together like cogs in a clock, especially the old grandfather clocks who are a little bit spooky. So he thought he'd add a spooky element. So now I'm going to read to you the next part. So it's part 1 of the story. As I'm reading the first part of the story, I want you to listen out for and jot down some of your ideas to these questions, okay? Where is the story set? Who is Herr Ringelmann? Why is Carl so upset? And who is Fritz? Okay, so here we go. Once upon a time, when time ran by clockwork, a strange event took place in a little German town. Actually, it was a series of events, all fitting together like the parts of a clock. And although each person saw a different part, no one saw the whole of it. But here it is, as well as I can tell it. It began on a winter's evening when the townsfolk were gathering in the White Horse Tavern. The snow was blowing down from the mountains and the wind was making the bells shift restlessly in the church tower. The windows were steamed up. The stove was blazing brightly. Putsy, the old black cat, was snoozing on the hearth, and the air was full of the rich smells of sausage and sauerkraut, of tobacco and beer. Gretel, the little barmaid, the landlord's daughter, was hurrying to and fro with foaming mugs and steaming plates. The door opened, and fat white flakes of snow swirled in to faint away into water as they met the heat of the parlour. The incomers, Herr Ringelmann, the clockmaker, and his apprentice Carl, stamped their boots and shook the snow off their great coats. "It's Herr Ringelmann," said the burgomaster. "Well, old friend, come and drink some beer with me. And a mug for young, what's-his-name, your apprentice." Carl, the apprentice, nodded his thanks and went to sit by himself in a corner. His expression was dark and gloomy. "What's the matter with young Thingamajig?" said the burgomaster. "He looks as if he swallowed a thundercloud." "Oh, I shouldn't worry," said the old clockmaker, sitting down at the table with his friends. "He's anxious about tomorrow. His apprenticeship is coming to an end, you see." "Ah, of course," said the burgomaster. It was the custom that when a clockmaker's apprentice finished his period of service, he made a new figure for the great clock of Glockenheim. "So we're to have a new piece of clockwork in the tower? Well, I look forward to seeing it tomorrow." "I remember when my apprenticeship came to an end," said Herr Ringelmann. "I couldn't sleep for thinking about what would happen when my figure came out of the clock. Supposing I hadn't counted the cogs properly. Supposing the spring was too stiff. Supposing, 1,000 things go through your mind. It's a heavy responsibility." "Maybe so, but I've never seen the lad look so gloomy before," said someone else, "and he's not a cheerful fellow at the best of times." And it seemed to the other drinkers that Herr Ringelmann himself was a little downhearted, but he raised his mug with the rest of them and changed the conversation to another topic. "I hear young Fritz, the novelist, is going to read us his new story tonight," he said. "So I believe," said the burgomaster. "I hope it's not as terrifying as the last one he read to us." Do you know, I woke 3 times that night and found my hair on end just thinking about it. I don't know if it's more frightening hearing them here in the parlour or reading them later on your own, said someone else. It's worse on your own, believe me, said another. You can feel the ghostly fingers creeping up your spine, and even when you know what's going to happen next, you can't help jumping when it does. Blah. Then they argued about whether it was more terrifying to hear a ghost story when you didn't know what was going to happen because it took you by surprise, or when you did because there was the suspense of waiting for it. They all enjoyed ghost stories, and Fritz's in particular, for he was a talented storyteller. The subject of their conversation, Fritz, the writer himself, was a cheerful-looking young man who had been eating his supper at the other end of the parlour. He joked with the landlord, he laughed with his neighbours, and when he'd finished, he called for another mug of beer, gathered up the untidy pile of manuscript beside his plate, and went to talk to Carl. Hello, old boy, he said cheerfully. All set for tomorrow? I'm looking forward to it. What are you going to show us? Carl scowled and turned away. The artistic temperament, said the landlord wisely. Drink up your beer and have another on the house in honour of tomorrow. Put poison in, and I'll drink it then, muttered Carl. What? Said Fritz, who could hardly believe his ears. The two of them were sitting right at the end of the bar, and Fritz moved so as to turn his back on the rest of the company and speak to Carl in private. What's the matter, old fellow? He went on quietly. You've been working at your masterpiece for months. Surely you're not worried about it? It can't fail. Carl looked at him with a face full of savage bitterness. I haven't made a figure, he muttered. I couldn't do it. I've failed, Fritz. The clock will chime tomorrow and everyone will be looking up to see what I've done, and nothing will come out. Nothing. He groaned softly, and turned away. I can't face them, he went on. I should go and throw myself off the tower now and have done with it. Oh, come on, don't talk like that, said Fritz, who had never seen his friend so bitter. You must have a word with old Herr Ringelmann. Ask his advice. Tell him you've hit a snag. He's a decent old fellow. He'll help you out. You don't understand, said Carl passionately. Everything's so easy for you. You just sit at your desk and put pen to paper and stories come pouring out. You don't know what it is to sweat and strain for hours on end with no ideas at all, or to struggle with materials that break and tools that go blunt, or to tear your hair out trying to find a new variation on the same old theme. I tell you, Fritz, it's a wonder I haven't blown my brains out long before this. Well, it won't be long now. Tomorrow morning you can all laugh at me. Carl, the failure. Carl, the hopeless. Carl, the first apprentice to fail in hundreds of years of clockmaking. I don't care. I shall be lying at the bottom of the river under the ice. Fritz has had to stop himself interrupting when Carl spoke about the difficulty of working. Stories are just as hard as clocks to put together, and they can go wrong just as easily, as we shall see with Fritz's own story in a page or two. Still, Fritz was an optimist, and Carl was a pessimist, and that makes all the difference in the world. Putsy, the cat, waking from his snooze on the hearth, came and rubbed his back against Carl's legs. Carl kicked him savagely away. Steady on, said Fritz. But Carl only scowled. He drank deeply and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before banging the mug on the counter and calling for more. Gretel, the young barmaid, looked anxiously at Fritz because she was only a child and wasn't sure whether she should be serving someone in Carl's condition. Give him some more, said Fritz. He's not drunk, poor fellow. He's unhappy. I'll keep an eye on him, don't you worry. So Gretel poured some more beer for Carl, and the clockmaker's apprentice scowled and turned away. Fritz was worried about him, but he couldn't stay there any longer because the patrons were calling for him. Come on, Fritz, where's that story? Sing for your supper. Come on, we're all waiting. What's it about this time, eh? Skeletons or ghosts? I hope it's a nice bloody murder. No, I hear he's got something quite different for us this time, something quite new. I've got a feeling it's going to be a more horrible than anything we could imagine, said old Johann, the woodcutter. While the drinkers ordered some more mugs of beer to see them through the story, and filled their pipes and settled themselves comfortably, Fritz gathered up his manuscript and took up his place by the stove. To tell the truth, Fritz was less comfortable himself than he had ever been before at one of these storytelling evenings, because of what Carl had just told him, and because of the theme of his story, of the start of it anyway. But after all, it wasn't about Carl. The subject was really quite different. There was another reason, private reason, for Fritz to be nervous. The fact was, he hadn't actually finished the story. He'd written the start all right, and it was terrific, but he hadn't been able to think of an ending. He was just going to wind up the story, set it going, and make up the end when he got there. And as I said just now, he was an optimist. "We're all ready and waiting," said the burgomaster. "I'm looking forward to this story, even if it does make my hair stand on end. What's it called?" "It's called," said Fritz, with a nervous glance at Carl, "it's called Clockwork." "Ah, very appropriate," cried old Herr Ringelmann. "Did you hear that, Carl? This is a story in your honour, my boy." Carl scowled and looked down at the floor. "No, no," said Fritz hastily. "This story isn't about Carl or the clock in our town. No, not at all. It's quite different. It just happens to be called Clockwork." "Well, set it going," said someone. "We're all ready." So Fritz cleared his throat and arranged his papers and began. Okay, so now you've heard the first part of the first chapter of the book. Now I want you to think about doing the activities. That's writing. I want you to try and start this before we get together this week, okay? So I want you to imagine that you're a tourist. I want you to think about types of people that would be visiting the clock. And you're spending the day in Glockenheim, okay? You're going to visit the Great Clock. That's your main activity that day. That's what you've been looking forward to all the time. And I want you to write a diary describing your day visiting the clock. So I want you to think about describing your day. You don't have to do all of the day. I would do it up until quick, brief introduction about the beginning of your day until you get to the clock. Then I want you to talk about why you wanted to see the clock. And then last of all, how you felt about watching the figures come out. So it's all on your slideshow. So have a look at that one. And then I've given you underneath an example opening of what you could write. Okay. So have a go at writing, and I will see you in the week. Okay. See you next time.